Hey guys, welcome to this month's skin tutorial. So in this tutorial, I'm going to be talking about how to render skin, and I'm going to walk you guys through some of the steps that I take in order to make my character's skin look realistic. And with that being said, let's jump straight into the topic. So the first thing that I want to do here for you guys is to break down some of the main components that I'm going to be talking about in this tutorial. It's going to be very simple, but I want to explain it first so that you guys can understand the concepts and take it with you as we go along into the walkthroughs. So on the screen here, I have a couple of portrait shots, very simple. And if you were to approach painting the skin on these portraits, sometimes it could be a little bit overwhelming. So the way that I like to approach skin that makes it a little bit easier for me to understand, a little bit simpler for me to render, is to isolate the shadow and the light shapes. And what I mean by this is we want to identify the main light source, the key light that is lighting our character. Doesn't matter if it's super diffused or if it's like really strong. And then we want to find the areas on the face that are in shadow and the areas of the face that are in light. So we want to break it down into two main colors, and that's the first thing we're going to do. So the first concept is really breaking things down into two main components. There's a light and there's a shadow. Now I know there's a ton of transitional hues on skin, especially in between the lights and the shadows, but we don't want to worry about that right now, because if you start thinking about that too early on, it's going to become very overwhelming. Now I'm just going to draw over the portraits to identify where the lights are, and we're breaking it down into only two categories. So I'm going to find the shapes of the light. I'm just following the line of shadow. Right? Sometimes it's very subtle, but it's still very identifiable. And we want to start training our brains to being able to simplify these things and identify it when we see it. So now everything within this shape right here is actually situated in the shadow region of the face, and everything else on this side, including the ear, jaw, and this side of the neck, that's the light portion of the face. So we've broken it down into the shadows and the lights. Very similar for the second one. We got a strong light source here, and the face is really like blasted out with light, but we can still identify where some of the shadow elements are going to be. So right there, some of the shadow from the lashes. We're going to get some of that on the eye as well, and the shadow on the nose. So we want to find these shapes, and we want to really just separate them from the light areas. Now these shapes make up the shadow component of this portrait, and everything else is going to be in light. Now for the third portrait, we're going to do the exact same thing. The lighting is really diffused, but we can still identify where the shadows or the main shadows are going to start. And right under the neck as well, there's a bit of a cast shadow from the jaw. And then everything else in this portrait is going to be a part of the light. So I'm going to turn off the original layer real quick here. And these don't look like finished portraits. They're very abstract, but we can still get a sense of the form of the face just based on the information provided in these shapes. And by us taking this concept and applying it to the way we render skin, it's going to really simplify that process and make your skin rendering a lot more believable right off the bat. So that's concept number one, okay? Really simple. And now we're gonna go on to the second concept, which is called local color. And this is something that you've probably heard before, but it basically refers to the color of an object without any light affecting it. So if we're thinking about the local color of skin, there's gonna be different tones and different hues on your face that are going to appear in different areas. So if we look at these photographs, okay, it's going to be very subtle, but there's some things that I want to point out. Now the face is not just one flat color, and it actually shifts as you go from the top to the bottom. So usually what I find to be the most believable way to convey a face that looks lively is to add a little bit of blush towards the middle section of the face. So if you're looking at the face in this area, there's usually a little bit more warmth to the actual hue that you're going to apply there, and it's going to make the character look just a little bit more alive. And if the ears are visible on your character, I also find that the warmer hue tends to show itself towards the upper tip of the ear as well. Actually, if you're looking at me right now, you can see that right there. That's a little bit warmer than what you see on the bottom. So that's one area of the local color. Another one is gonna be the lips. Obviously, the lips are gonna be very red in their hue. And usually when I'm painting, I like to use the color that I apply to the middle section of the face and kind of amplify the saturation and the darkness of it a little bit. And usually I would apply that to the lips and it would be a pretty coherent look. So taking that concept onto the second piece as well, we can see there's a much warmer hue on the nose area as well as on this area. So this is a very natural occurrence in a lot of faces because there's a lot more flesh there. There's a lot more area for blood to flow through versus the area on the forehead where it's just pretty much just skin against your skull. And once again, the lips kind of reflect the color that you see on the midsection of the face. And as we go on to the third portrait as well, you're gonna be able to observe the same thing happening. So there's a little bit more of a warmer hue on the cheeks. You can't really see it on the nose, but if I were to draw this character, I would probably extend the warm hue onto the nose as well. And on the lips, again, a stronger, more saturated version of what you find on the cheek. So the local color of these areas are going to be a little bit warmer than the local colors, say on the chin or on the forehead. So I like to treat the middle section of the face as well as the tips of the ears as a little bit warmer. And if you're not too clear on what like the warmth and cool scale is, usually when we're drawing skin, we're going to be within this range of colors on the hue slider. And as we go towards the greens, the color gets cooler. As we go down towards the red, the color gets warmer. So when we're looking at an area like the forehead, we might get something that's closer to the yellows, whereas if we're looking at an area like the nose, we might get something that's closer to the red. That was concept number 2, local color. And these are the 2 main concepts that we want to keep in mind as we render skin. Now there is a third one that can be applied to certain lighting scenarios. So in a very strong lighting scenario, like the one you see in the middle, you're gonna get a lot of subsurface scattering. And if you don't know what subsurface scattering is, it's basically when light hits your skin, part of it is going to go through your skin and part of it is gonna escape from your skin out, and it's going to carry with it the color of your blood. So it's going to give you a very vibrant, very saturated kind of look. That's why when you see areas like the tear duct right there and right there, they're a lot more saturated than an area that might be in ambient occlusion like that. And that's because the light is shining down, hitting the skin, it's going into the skin, it's passing through the skin, and when it comes back out, it's going to carry with it some of the color of our blood, which is red. And you've also got a very similar thing happening on the neck here. So the light is shining down, there's a shadow here, and some of the light is going to go into the skin and come back out. And when it comes back out through the shadow area, you can see a little bit more saturation than in here. And the name subsurface scattering is pretty self-explanatory because in a sense, the light is literally scattering underneath the surface of your skin. So subsurface scattering. But don't worry, we'll talk a little bit more about this as it comes up when we actually go to render some of these portraits. So to recap, 2 main concepts: we want to find the light, the shadow, and we want to be aware of the local colors on the skin. And in certain scenarios, we also want to think about subsurface scattering. Okay, now onto the second part of our tutorial. I'm going to give you guys an exercise that's really good for understanding light and shadow on the face. So it's going to help you be able to isolate those shapes and help you identify them. Now this is also going to prep you for the next step, which is the actual rendering. Now we have a bunch of reference photos here. We're going to start from the top left. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look for the shadow color on the face right here. Now as we use the eyedropper tool, we can see that her skin tone is of a slightly darker complexion, and it is more leaning towards the cooler range. So that's exactly what we're going to use. We're going to try to find a shadow color, and don't be afraid when you're picking the color. Do not be afraid to go into a more saturated range. Something that I find really negatively affects a lot of people's portraits is the fear of going into more saturated areas. So if you stay within the grays, you're going to get a color for the skin that looks very dead. And it's really easy to make it look muddy and dirty. So we're gonna go into a pretty saturated area, okay? And we're going to find right now the general color of the shadow. Now I know there's a lot of nuance in there, but we don't want to worry about that at all. Just kind of map out the shape of the head. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to find the color that best represents the light. And remember, being able to find the color takes a lot of trial and error, and usually I'm able to find it pretty quick due to, you know, just having a lot of experience with painting faces in general, but it's totally fine if you take a few tries to get the right color. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply it onto the face, onto the areas where we see the light. I'm just gonna give her some hair so you can tell what's going on. And there's our idea of the light and the shadow. So that's our first concept of breaking things down into two main colors. This makes approaching a portrait a lot more easy to understand, and it sets a really solid foundation for your skin rendering that you can then start to build on top of. Now it's not accurate, it's not super detailed, but it's a really good practice method for you to start training your brain to start seeing in these shapes instead of getting caught up on the tiny small little details and the tiny nuances and the hue shifts that don't really matter when you're starting a portrait. So it's not the prettiest thing, but we'll move on to the next one because it's just a very simple exercise to start thinking in a different way. Now moving on to our second portrait at the bottom left, she has much darker skin, and what we're gonna find is it's gonna lean a lot more into the red range, and it's going to be quite saturated as well on the dark end. What I'm going to use is a pretty rich, deep, almost like a maroon kind of color for the shadow region of her skin. And I'm just going to map out the shape of the entire face here. Once I have this, I want to find the light areas. I'm going to apply that onto the areas where I see the light. Okay, so once again, very fast, super simple, not very flattering at all, but we got the idea down for the light and shadow portions of the skin on the face. And this is all about building that solid foundation. I'm gonna do the exact same thing for the two portraits on the right as well. I'm gonna look for the color that best suits the face here. And find the color of the shadow. So something like that, again, very simple. And the colors that I picked for the shadow and the light are the colors that I think best represent the general area that make up the light and the shadow. I'm gonna do the exact same thing for the last portrait. Yeah, these look borderline creepy, but you get the point of this exercise. We're really trying to train our brains to start simplifying things, to start thinking in terms of the lights and the shadows and these big shapes, so that when we start to approach our rendering phase, which we're going to talk about next, we can have a solid foundation that we can build off of. And also in this exercise, we are not thinking about the local colors, we're not thinking about the tiny shifts in the hue from the light to the shadows, we're just trying to isolate these big shapes and trying to think in terms of shadow and light. So yeah, if you guys have some time, give this exercise a shot. see if you can use just 2 different colors to convey a face and make it look like a face. It's a lot harder than it looks, and it's really going to force your brain to start thinking in a different way. And don't worry about the final result and having it look pretty and all that, because it really doesn't have to. This is just a quick, rough and fast exercise to get you going.